don't trust this story, not because it sounds ridiculous, not because it's obviously false, but because it sounds just believable enough to slip past your guard, and millions of people have already let it in. That's how it spread. Not through evidence, not through confirmation, but through repetition. There are videos all over the internet claiming that Mel Gibson traveled to Ethiopia while filming The Passion of the Christ and discovered something the rest of the world was never supposed to see. Ancient texts, forgotten books, secrets about Jesus that were supposedly removed from the Bible. And the way these stories are told is what makes them powerful, because they don't sound like theories, they sound like revelations. Some videos go even further. They claim he uncovered writings about angels, not the kind you hear about in church, but something darker, something more complex. Beings that descended to Earth, interacted with humanity, changed the course of history. Others talk about giants, ancient beings, stories that sound like they belong in myth, but are presented as if they were once part of Scripture. And if you listen closely, every version of this story carries the same tone. Not uncertainty, not speculation, but confidence, as if this is something people already know, but just haven't admitted yet. And that's where the story becomes dangerous. Because once something is told with enough certainty, it stops feeling like a claim and starts feeling like a fact. But here's the problem. None of these videos can show you where the story actually started. No verified interview from Mel Gibson, no confirmed statement, no behind-the-scenes footage, no record of him ever saying he discovered anything in Ethiopia. Just repetition. One video repeats another. Another adds more detail. Another adds more drama. Until eventually, a story that was never confirmed starts to feel undeniable. And that's how belief is built, without evidence. And here's the part most people don't realize. This doesn't happen because people are careless. It happens because people are curious. Because if you're watching this right now, there's a good chance you've seen something like this before. A video, a post, or a headline that said, "What they didn't tell you, what was removed, what you were never meant to know." And something about that made you stop scrolling. Not because you wanted to believe it blindly, but because it felt like there might be something more, something deeper, something hidden. And that instinct is exactly what this story feeds on. So instead of repeating the story, we decided to do something most people don't. We traced it. Not just the claims, but the origin. Where did it come from? What did Mel Gibson actually say? Did he ever mention Ethiopia? Did he ever reference hidden texts? And why, out of all the places in the world, does Ethiopia keep appearing in conversations about lost Christianity? Because when you follow those questions far enough, you don't just find answers. You find something unexpected, something far more grounded, and at the same time, far more fascinating than the myth itself. Because Ethiopia isn't random. It's not just a name people attach to stories to make them sound ancient. It holds something real, something that has existed long before the internet, long before viral videos, long before modern debates about hidden truth. A tradition, a history, a version of scripture that most people in the United States have never actually encountered. And the moment people discover that, everything starts to shift. Because now the question changes. It's no longer, What did Mel Gibson see? It becomes something deeper, something more unsettling. If this has been here the whole time, why don't more people know about it? And that's the exact moment where curiosity turns into speculation. Because once that question is asked, people don't always wait for answers. They start creating them, filling in the gaps, connecting dots that were never meant to be connected, until eventually a real piece of history gets wrapped inside a story that was never verified. And that's how the myth begins. Not with a lie, but with a truth that gets stretched, misinterpreted, and slowly rewritten. So, before we talk about what Mel Gibson did or didn't see, we need to understand the thing people keep attaching his name to, because without that, nothing else in this story makes sense. And what you're about to see isn't hidden. It never was. You might not see this channel again, so do well to subscribe, turn on post notifications, and share this video to your families or friends so they learn from this video. Are you in the United States like myself? Or somewhere else around the world? Let me know in the comments section below. There is a version of the Bible that most people in the United States have never read, not because it's forbidden, not because it's locked away, not because someone is hiding it, but because it developed differently, and that difference changed everything. It's known as the Ethiopian Bible, used by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, a Christian tradition that has existed for nearly 2,000 years, unbroken, continuous, all preserved across generations, through language, through culture, through isolation from much of the Western world. And that last part is important, because while Christianity in Europe and the Middle East was evolving through councils, translations, and debates, Ethiopia was developing along a different path. Not disconnected from Christianity, but not fully shaped by the same decisions either. To understand this, you have to step back, because when most people in America think of the Bible, they're thinking of a very specific version, a structure, a collection of books that feels fixed, familiar, almost unquestionable. 66 books, Old Testament, New Testament, printed, standardized, and repeated across generations. But historically, it wasn't always that simple. In the early centuries of Christianity, there wasn't just one agreed-upon list of books. There were communities, different regions, different traditions, all preserving, reading, and valuing different texts. And over time, those differences became structure, and that structure became canon. But not everywhere made the same decisions. And that's where things begin to shift, because the Ethiopian Bible doesn't contain just 66 books. It contains more, books that many Western Christians have never encountered, never studied, never even heard mentioned. And one of the most talked about is the Book of Enoch, a text that feels different because it expands on ideas that appear only briefly in more familiar scripture. It describes angels descending to earth, beings known as watchers, all interactions between heaven and humanity that go beyond what most people expect. And because of that, when people first hear about it, it doesn't feel like something ancient. It feels like something hidden. And this is the moment where the internet takes over. Because as soon as people hear, there are books in another Bible that they've never seen before, their mind starts filling in the gaps. They were removed. They were hidden. They contain secrets. And those ideas are spread fast because they don't require explanation. They require imagination. But here's the part most people miss. Those books weren't suddenly discovered. They weren't secretly uncovered. They weren't pulled out of the ground after being lost for centuries. They were always there, read, studied, preserved, so within a different tradition. The truth is simpler, but simplicity is often less exciting than mystery. Different Christian traditions recognized different collections of texts. Some included Enoch, some didn't. Some preserved additional writings. Others narrowed the canon over time, not because one group was hiding something, but because history is complex, messy, human, and shaped by decisions that unfolded over centuries. Councils, debates, translations, cultural influence, geographic separation, all of it played a role, and Ethiopia followed its own path. So what you're looking at is not a hidden version of the Bible. It's a different development of the same faith, preserved in a way that feels unfamiliar to those who grew up with a different structure. And unfamiliar is where confusion begins. Because when something doesn't match what we expect, we don't always assume difference. Sometimes, we assume deception. And that's where the shift happens. Because now, the discovery of something new feels like the exposure of something hidden. And that changes the story completely. Instead of asking, why is this different? People start asking, why was this kept from us? And those two questions lead in completely different directions. Because once that second question takes over, everything starts to change. Now the Ethiopian tradition is no longer seen as a parallel history. It's seen as a missing piece. And once that idea settles in, it doesn't take much for someone to connect it to a familiar name, a filmmaker, a story, on a moment that may have never happened, but feels like it should have. And that's the turning point, because now the question isn't, what is the Ethiopian Bible? The question becomes, if this existed the whole time, why don't more people know about it? And that's the exact moment where curiosity turns into speculation, and speculation starts building a story. So now we know something important. There is a Bible tradition that includes books most people in the United States have never read, and that alone is enough to spark curiosity. But curiosity doesn't stay neutral for long, because when people encounter something unfamiliar, they don't just ask questions, they start looking for explanations. And when clear answers aren't immediately available, something else happens. They begin to create their own. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but instinctively. Because the human mind doesn't like unfinished stories. It fills gaps, connects dots, builds meaning, even when the connections aren't real. And that is exactly where Mel Gibson gets pulled into the story. Somewhere along the way, the narrative shifts. It stops being about the Ethiopian Bible and becomes about a man who supposedly discovered it. And when that shift happens, the story becomes more compelling, because now it has a face, a recognizable figure, a sense of credibility. The story usually sounds like this, that while filming The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson traveled to Ethiopia and encountered ancient texts that revealed hidden truths about Christianity, books that were removed, stories that were covered up, knowledge that was never meant to be known. and the more the story is told, the more detailed it becomes. Some versions say he was shown manuscripts inside ancient churches. Others claim he studied texts that expanded on angels and giants. Some even suggest that what he saw influenced the way he portrayed Jesus on screen. And here's what makes this powerful. Because the passion of the Christ felt so real, so raw, so intense, people don't just see it as a film, they see it as something closer to truth. And once that happens, it's easy to believe the person behind it must have had access to something deeper, something hidden. But here's where everything changes. When you stop listening to the story and start looking for the evidence. Because if something that significant happened, there should be a trace. Think about it. In the United States today, if a filmmaker discovered something that could reshape how people understand Christianity, it wouldn't stay quiet. There would be interviews, headlines, behind-the-scenes footage, podcast discussions, press coverage. We've seen it happen before. When a movie even slightly touches controversial material, it spreads everywhere. So something this big, it wouldn't be hidden. It would be everywhere. So we look carefully, consistently, without assumptions. And what do we find? Nothing. No verified statement from Mel Gibson. No interview where he says he discovered Ethiopian texts. No documented evidence that those books influenced his film. No trace of the story people are repeating. Just silence. And that silence matters, because silence is where imagination begins. When people don't have answers, they don't stop the story. They complete it. And usually, they complete it in the most compelling way possible. Think about how rumors spread in everyday life. A small, unclear detail gets repeated. Someone adds context. Another person adds emotion. And before long, the story feels complete, even if no one actually knows the original truth. The same thing happens here, except now it's happening on a global scale. Because a filmmaker who created one of the most intense portrayals of Jesus ever seen feels like someone who must know something others don't. That's the illusion. It's not based on evidence. It's based on perception. And perception is powerful. Because once someone appears credible, people stop questioning and start trusting. So what did Mel Gibson actually do? Instead of chasing hidden books, he focused on something far more grounded. Historical realism. He wanted the film to feel authentic. Not just visually, but linguistically. That's why The Passion of the Christ was filmed in Aramaic, Latin, Hebrew languages spoken during the time of Jesus. And for most modern audiences, that choice was unusual. Subtitles, foreign speech, no simplification. But that was the point. Not to hide meaning, but to preserve it. His goal wasn't to reveal secrets, it was to make people feel something they had stopped feeling. The weight of the crucifixion, the brutality, the suffering, the human cost. Because over time, familiar stories lose their emotional impact. They become routine, comfortable, distant, and his film brought that reality back. Not by adding hidden knowledge, but by intensifying what was already known. Because for him, the power of the story wasn't in what was hidden. It was in what people already knew, but no longer fully felt. And that difference is everything. So now we're left with something strange. A real, ancient, complex Christian tradition being connected to a filmmaker who never claimed to discover it. And once you see that clearly, a bigger question emerges. If Mel Gibson didn't create this story, then who did? And more importantly, why did it spread so easily? At this point, the story should feel different, not because we revealed something hidden, but because we removed something that wasn't there. And what's left isn't just a misunderstanding, it's a pattern. Because the connection between Mel Gibson and hidden Ethiopian discoveries didn't come from him. It came from something else, something far more powerful, the way we think. Because humans don't just search for truth, we search for hidden truth. And there's a difference. If someone tells you, here's what the Bible says, you listen. But if someone tells you, here's what was removed from the Bible, you lean in. Because now it feels like access, like you're stepping behind the curtain, like you're seeing something other people missed. And that feeling is addictive. Think about it in a modern context. In the US, headlines that say what they don't want you to know, the truth they hid from you, what really happened behind the scenes, consistently outperform regular factual headlines. Not because they're always true, but because they feel important. They trigger curiosity and urgency at the same time. And once that feeling is activated, logic takes a step back. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this isn't about other people. It's about all of us. At some point, you've probably clicked on something like that. A video, a post, a headline. Not because you believed it immediately, but because something inside you said, what if this is true? And that what if is enough. Now layer that with something even deeper. Faith. Because when you hear books were removed from the Bible, it doesn't just sound interesting, it feels personal. It raises questions like, was something important taken away? Have I been missing part of the story? What else don't I know? And once those questions enter your mind, they don't leave easily, because they're not just intellectual, they're emotional. We've seen this pattern before. Think about how quickly conspiracy-style narratives spread online, even when evidence is weak. If the story suggests there's more going on behind the scenes, people engage with it, they share it, they discuss it. Not because they're irrational, but because uncertainty feels like something that needs to be resolved, and stories like this offer resolution, even if it's not accurate. Now add another layer. Location. Ethiopia. To many people in the US, it feels ancient, distant, less influenced by modern systems. And because of that, it carries a certain weight, a sense of preservation. Almost like, if something original survived, this is where it would be. And that perception makes the story feel even more believable, even before any evidence is presented. Then comes the final piece, a recognizable figure, or Mel Gibson, someone associated with realism, intensity, emotional truth, and suddenly, the story feels complete, because now it's not just, there are hidden texts. It becomes, someone credible discovered them. And that changes everything, because people trust people more than they trust information. Now combine everything. Hidden truth, emotional investment, ancient location, trusted figure. And what you get is a narrative that feels undeniable, even without proof. But feeling true and being true are not the same thing. And that's where most people stop. They feel it, they accept it, they move on, without ever asking, Where did this actually come from? Because if you follow that question, you start to see something fascinating. This wasn't a discovery. It was a construction, a story built, piece by piece, by different people who never realized they were contributing to it. One person shares a claim, another repeats it, another adds detail, and over time, the story becomes stronger than the truth itself. And that's the moment everything shifts. Because now, you're not just looking at a story, you're looking at a system, a pattern of how information spreads, how belief forms, and how easily something unverified can become widely accepted. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it, because now the question changes again. It's no longer, did this happen? It becomes, what's actually true? And the answer to that is simpler than most people expect. At this point, we've taken the story apart, piece by piece. We've looked at the claims, we've followed the evidence, we've stepped back and understood why people believe it. And what we found wasn't a hidden discovery. It was something else, something quieter, something less dramatic, but far more important. Because the story people tell is simple, that Mel Gibson went to Ethiopia and found something the world had lost, something buried, something removed, something hidden on purpose. And that idea is powerful because it turns the story into a revelation, a discovery, a moment of uncovering truth. But the real answer doesn't work like that. The truth is, Mel Gibson didn't discover something hidden in Ethiopia. The world simply ignored something that was always there. Those texts, those books, those traditions, they weren't buried. They weren't locked away. They weren't secretly uncovered. They existed for centuries, preserved, read, respected, within a different Christian tradition. A tradition that developed alongside others, but not in the same direction. And because of that, most people outside of it never paid attention. But when people finally did notice, they didn't see it for what it was. They saw it through a different lens. Instead of asking, why is this tradition different? They asked, why was this hidden? And that one shift in perspective changed everything. Because once you assume something was hidden, you stop investigating and start believing. Because here's something most people never consider. Not everything unfamiliar is a secret. Sometimes it's just something you were never exposed to, and that difference is critical. Think about how many things exist today that feel surprising simply because you hadn't encountered them before. Different cultures, different traditions, different interpretations of the same history. When you first see them, they can feel new, even hidden. But they weren't hidden. You just hadn't seen them yet. And that's what happened here. The Ethiopian tradition, including the Ethiopian Bible, was never trying to hide. It was preserving, holding on to a version of history that developed differently. And when that version finally reached a wider audience, it didn't feel like a difference. It felt like a discovery. And that feeling is what created the myth. Because when people experience something new, they don't always interpret it accurately. They interpret it emotionally, and emotion is what turns information into belief. So what you're really looking at is not a story about hidden knowledge. It's a story about perception, about how easily something real can be misunderstood when it's seen out of context. And maybe that's the most important part, because this isn't just about Mel Gibson. It's not just about Ethiopia. It's not even just about the Bible. It's about how we think, how we interpret, how we react when we encounter something unfamiliar. Because sometimes the biggest mystery isn't what was hidden. It's how we misunderstood what was always there. By now, the story should feel different. Not because we added something new, but because we removed something that didn't belong. And what's left isn't louder. It's quieter, clearer, more grounded. And sometimes clarity doesn't feel as exciting as mystery, but it's always more honest. Because this was never really a story about Mel Gibson traveling to Ethiopia and discovering something hidden. It was a story about what happens when unfamiliar truth meets human curiosity, and how quickly that curiosity can turn into something else: assumption, interpretation, narrative. The Ethiopian tradition, including the Ethiopian Bible, was never trying to hide anything. It wasn't waiting to be discovered. It wasn't lost. It simply existed outside the version of Christianity most people in the United States grew up with. And that difference is what created the illusion. Because when something doesn't match what you've always known, it doesn't just feel new. It feels suspicious. And that reaction is natural. If you've spent your entire life hearing one version of something, and suddenly you're introduced to another, your first instinct isn't always curiosity. Sometimes it's doubt, and sometimes it's the need to explain it quickly. And that's where stories like this are born, not from deception, but from discomfort. Because uncertainty is something people try to resolve immediately, and the fastest way to resolve uncertainty is with a story that feels complete, even if it isn't accurate. Think about how often this happens outside of this topic. A headline spreads before the full story is known. A clip goes viral without context. A moment gets interpreted before it's fully understood. And by the time the full picture emerges, the first version is already what people believe. Not because it's true, but because it came first. And maybe that's what makes this story so powerful. Because it's not just about religion. It's not just about history. It's about something much closer. How easily we accept what feels right over what can be verified. Because the real danger was never hidden knowledge. It was misunderstood knowledge. And misunderstanding, it doesn't need intention. It only needs repetition. So maybe the question was never, what did Mel Gibson see in Ethiopia? Maybe the better question is, why did we need the story to be more mysterious than it actually was? Because sometimes the truth doesn't come hidden. It comes unnoticed. Not because it was taken away, but because no one thought to look. And when it finally appears, it doesn't feel familiar. It feels unexpected. And that's where confusion begins. Because in the end, the most powerful truths aren't always the ones that were hidden. They're the ones that were always there, waiting for someone to finally see them for what they are. If this made you rethink what you thought you knew, don't ignore it, because the most believable stories aren't always the most accurate. So if Mel Gibson didn't discover the hidden Ethiopian texts, then what did he actually use to create one of the most realistic portrayals of Jesus ever filmed? Because the answer in the next video, being part 2, is something most people have never heard of. I have linked the video answer to the end of this video, so you can just click and watch. Share this video to a friend, like, share and subscribe to this channel. I will see you in the next video. Good night, and God bless you.